Could you introduce yourself and your relationship to Path Out?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Frederik Smets. I'm the Education Officer for the Regional Bureau of UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. And we are using Path Out as part of our catalog of teaching materials for education projects around refugees.
How did that process of introducing Path Out into your teaching materials come about?
So first of all, Path Out was developed by or co-developed by COMTOG Creations, a video development company in Vienna, in Austria. And it was developed with our local office of UNHCR in Austria. So it was basically a game that had been developed as a sort of a media tool out there. And we all know the story of the game and how it was developed by asylum, who then put his own story into that video game. And it was actually a really nice tool for communications purposes initially. And at the regional office of UNHCR, we were actually developing at that point a whole catalog of teaching materials, which is now known as the Teaching About Refugees catalog of teaching materials, which contained videos, which contained lesson plans, which contained all manner of PDFs and graphics and things you could read and watch. But we wanted to really have an interactive thing there as well, which you could actually play, or which at least kids in primary or secondary education could play with. And of course, this game was ideal for those purposes. And so what we did is we took the Path Out game, already, and we basically shortened it a little bit so that it could be played within 1 hour of lessons in the secondary school. And then also created a sort of an instruction for teachers on how to use that game in the class context. So it's basically, we repurposed, if you will, a very neat little media project into an educational tool that now can be used in secondary education.
And who was a part of this, the editing or like the changing of the original video game into the shortened versions? Because obviously, as I played both versions, and there are some choices made, obviously, that is made to shorten it so that the children can do it within 1 lesson hour, but also some things become more prominent and others have been like removed. So was the UNHCR involved with this kind of process, or was it up to the video game creators?
Well, our only brief to COMTOG Creations was basically to shorten it down. So we left the choices of what needed to be cut from the game and what could be left in. We largely left up to their discretion. Also because they were, of course, the ones that have developed the narrative and things like that. And the important thing was just that it remained playable, of course. I mean, you don't want to shorten something and then basically ruin it. Or make the narrative completely inconsistent. So I think the narrative was the most important thing. So it needed to remain fun, and so COMTOG has been very brilliant in cutting out those pieces that were not exactly essential for the narrative. And the second criterion we sort of had for them, of course, was that it remained the story of refugee, or that the game served the purpose of showing, you know, what a refugee's journey was like, and that was obviously not very difficult to do because of the nature of the game and because of the nature of the narrative of the game. So it was a really light touch process, actually, where we basically gave them free rein to make that into a shorter educational version.
Yeah, I think the most interesting change that I noticed was that in the end of the shortened game, you meet his brother, and he says, you're like, oh, it's the end of the game, but then it's like, no, this is just the beginning, which is obviously a change from the longer version. I thought that was, it is also very relevant when you're teaching the children that, because this is a kind of, from that point on, that's the story they know better, I guess. So how does Path Out as a game complement UNHCR's other existing teacher materials on the refugee experience? How did you build out this kind of program?
So Teaching About Refugees finds its origins basically about 2015 and 2016 peak of arrivals of refugees and migrants that we've seen over the Mediterranean in those years in Europe. So you may recall, I mean, some of your viewers may recall the images we saw of people specifically from Syria and Iraq, the Middle East, also from Afghanistan, arriving on the Mediterranean at that point. And so there was, of course, a lot of arrivals in those 2 years. And in the wake of that, a lot of teachers in European schools started reaching out to UNHCR offices all across the continent, all across the region, asking basically for teaching materials. And they said, well, you know, you as a UNHCR, don't you have something that, you know, we can use to teach these kids about what they're seeing in the news, what they're seeing, you know, they see all these boats arrive in Greece, they see all these Syrians arrive in their classrooms, and how do we teach about that? So it was really something that was very much driven by a demand from teachers, essentially. And so we started scratching our heads a little bit, and then, you know, it took a couple of years to first develop a small set of teaching materials, essentially some animation films and stuff that we could then send to those teachers. But that was gradually over the years then developed into a full catalog and a full lesson plan actually for primary and secondary education. And that's what we now know as the Teaching About Refugees catalog. And so the addition of Path Out was basically just an extension of that catalog. So that catalog of teaching materials is regularly being updated. We regularly add new videos. We regularly update teaching sheets and lesson plans and things like that. And obviously, you don't want to just give teachers boring PDFs and you know, maybe a couple of funky animation films and things like that, but you also want to have kids do something in the classroom. And you can do debates and you can do exercises and you can do this, that, and the other. But obviously, we live in a very digitized world, and kids are very savvy on computers and things like that. And it's fun for them to just play a video game. And you know, I don't think there's a lot of teachers out there that play video games very regularly in their classrooms. But we just thought it was a very good tool to use as an educational, an educational tool in the classroom, so that kids could break out of that sort of classical learning, that they could just learn through playing a video game. And the first responses that we've had from teachers that have used the game in that setting have been very positive. So kids really appreciate the game. It looks a bit, in a sense, old-fashioned and sort of Super Mario Brothers like. So that's another thing. And they really get sucked into the story of that refugee that is trying to flee Syria. So it turns out to be a very effective learning tool as well.
Yeah, I think especially, you know, it being a game, a video game, you mentioned, it engages children and asks something for them to be actively participating, and obviously that format makes them experience the lesson. You touched on it already, but do you have any more responses or figures on where Path Out is being used in the classroom currently?
We don't have a very good handle yet on how and where the game is being used, simply because we've only started using it a couple of months ago for educational purposes. And the second thing as well is that it hasn't been translated in a lot of languages yet. So we have an English version, we have a German version. I believe there is also a French version in the making, and there's a couple of Nordic languages that we have planned as well, and that takes a little bit of time to produce those languages, and then also to add those to existing catalogs of teaching materials that we have in different countries. So it's a bit too new, it's a bit early days for us to see how well used this game will be. We expect to have some data on that probably at the end of this school year, so come June for next year. We'll probably be able to make a first sort of evaluation in a couple of countries where we have distributed the game. And then from next school year, probably we'll do a bit of a more wider distribution and more active promotion of the game as an educational tool as well. What we do have for the moment is some qualitative reactions from teachers that have used the game. Those are teachers that we've reached out to ourselves. We regularly work with teachers in several countries. And also a couple of teachers that have found the game on our website and then send us messages, for example, and those have been overwhelmingly positive. So it seems to be very engaging tool. It's short, it's snappy. It's something that's very interactive, and kids seem to like it as well. So I'm actually very happy to see that until now it seems to hit the mark, and we seem to have really hit a nerve with that game, and it seems to be good fun to play it in the classroom with teachers.
This question is less maybe related to the work itself, but maybe a broader question on do you see any kind of future with of video games in a classroom, that maybe more issues can be addressed in this way? Obviously, this is a question I've been asking more towards the video game producer side of things, or I spoke to an academic, Dr. Bill Watson, about this. He's specializing in serious games. So I in my discussion with Georg, he was saying that these kind of educational games really don't, or the funding of educational games and serious games don't fully have a future in these in the sector of serious games, because as a commercial product, it needs to sell, it needs to be kind of broadly appreciated. And then when I was speaking to Dr. Watson, he said that obviously maybe yeah, there's a big divide maybe between the commercial world and the serious games world. But yeah, he sees a bit more of a compromise between the two. I was wondering, maybe just in your position as someone who has now been engaging with a video game as an educational tool, do you see this being maybe a path forward in some other ways? Or yeah, just any perspective on that would be great.
Well, it's difficult to foresee how useful video games will be in the total sort of toolbox of teachers in the future. So my experience is that, and coming from a family of teachers as well, by the way, is that the profession of teaching has changed dramatically and drastically over the past 2 decades. So if I see young children go to school now, and if I see teachers in actions in classrooms now, and if I compare that to my own sort of school experiences in the 1980s and 1990s, this is completely and utterly different. So it is a very dynamic sector that is, education is a very dynamic sector that is, I think, subject to a lot of changes, specifically with regard to methodology that is being used. Obviously, there's a lot of digital tools out there, among which also video games. And I think a lot of the teaching went even more digital. That move towards digital teaching has been precipitated really by the COVID crisis as well, which was marked, of course, by school closures. At some point, I remember that around 80% of the world's schools were closed, and over 1.5 million children were basically learning online in some form. So that has had a very devastating and very profound impact, I think, also on the way teachers teach and students learn. So video games are obviously going to be a part of that, I think. And the capacity of computers, capacity of tablets, and the capacity even of presentation screens of some teachers in some schools is such that these can be very, very easily integrated into a lesson plan. These could be very easily made as well. So the production of these games has become very cheap, and they can perfectly be, I see these really as a mix of tools that can be used in sort of, if you will, a digital palette of education tools that teachers use these things. And so it's a very useful addition to that toolbox. I think whether or not these games will be effective will depend in a large part on the creativity that goes into making them, the enjoyability of playing them. Let's not forget that video games need to be fun, because otherwise they won't be played. And then thirdly, I think also I see more and more digital content producers actually giving it a good think about the pedagogy of these games. And I see a lot of excellent content out there. It's video game based, and that is basically teaching people things. So I do see this as a continued and expanding sort of part of the toolbox of teaching. And for our part, of course, if you teach about a very complex and international and global topic, such as refugees, I do think that there's a lot of benefit in focusing on those kind of tools to explain those very complex subjects in a very comprehensible and also in a fun way. that breaks us away from just staring at a teacher explaining the Geneva Conventions, for example.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a thorough answer. Yeah, no, I mean, just maybe something for you to respond. I mean, you make some points that are again similar to what Dr. Watson said, is that that because teachers are becoming younger, or the teachers today have already grown up with technology, have already grown up with video games. They've kind of been adapting these things into the things they've used in their daily lives, that they can adapt it into their teaching practices today. But there were some other discussions that came up. So, and I mean, you mentioned them vaguely, but there are some barriers to including video games in a classroom. Obviously, resource-wise, are there enough screens to go around if you really want enough children to play? But there are also, when I was speaking to Georg Hogmeier, he was saying that there was also some issues with, government or school boards, again, like their attitude towards video games, or the bureaucracy of national syllabi that trying to include video games. So in your attempt at distributing the path out, how is this? How have you experienced this?
So anybody that is involved in production of educational materials, be it video games or any other materials, will have to work with and within national school systems. So at the Bureau for Europe at UNHCR here in Geneva, we cover 49 countries. And, that's a lot of countries to cover. All those countries have different languages. There are so many different languages in Europe, and they all have their own education systems usually. And within countries in Europe, even you have regional authorities that organize their own education systems. I'm talking about countries like the UK, I'm talking about countries like Belgium, Germany also has 16 education ministries and things like that. And this just to say that it is a very, very highly complex environment to work in. So in my opinion, in my experience, it is almost impossible to just produce one piece of teaching material and expect that it will be used everywhere. So and that is why I think it's a good strategy for somebody that would produce education materials could be to produce snippets of teaching material that can be recombined so that they can fit the national curriculum. I think that is the key of this. And in some countries, teachers will be following in quite a strict set of instructions based on their local regulations, and they will have to use the textbook. And they may use, for example, a video game as some sort of a complement to what they are teaching. Whereas in other countries, teachers have much more freedom, and they might basically compose their own lesson plans. And there's a couple of countries in Europe certainly out there where teachers have a lot of freedom to be very creative. And so I think the important thing here to say is that in some countries, teachers will have greater degrees of freedom to use video games like this than in other countries, depending on what the local regulations are, and what the syllabus and what the curriculum or what the local regulations and curriculum basically prescribe for that teacher. And what we've tried to achieve with this game is that it could be used in all, if not most of those contexts, as a small part of the whole package that teachers would create, or as a part of the whole package that is mandated by the school authorities or by the government on things that need to be taught in this classroom. So it really needs to be a flexible sort of product. And I think from the first reaction that we had with this game, at least, I think we've succeeded in that. And it's very easy to include 20 minutes of game time into a computer class, or it can be played on a screen, but it can also be combined with more classical teaching, ex-cathedra teaching that is based on a textbook, for example. So because the game is so short, and because there is this flexibility of introducing it into different digital formats, be it on a website or be it on a laptop, or be it on a format in a phone and things like that. It gives a lot of freedom to slot it into whichever educational model is mandatory or is being used usually in any given country.
Yeah, interesting to hear like this bit more modular approach to allow us to be
Exactly.
flexible in different systems. So while this interview is, I mean, in my kind of cohort of interviews is mainly focused on the educational impact of video games, the project in general wants to address video games relationship with memory. So to end off the interview, I would like to ask a bit more broad question. In your view, can video games play a role in addressing society's collective memory of certain events? And so obviously in the context of Kapata, that is the migration crisis.
Yes, that's a very difficult and broad question, because you have to ask yourself what determines the memory of certain events. And I think media and digital media specifically plays the biggest role, and of course video games can be a part of that whole mix. I very much see video games as a narrative form, often also a fictional form, that often will produce great content quite a bit of time after certain events have taken place. I mean, after, for example, the war in Vietnam, we didn't immediately see Vietnam movies in Hollywood. We had to wait for those for a couple of years, at least until the 1970s, when a couple of very famous Vietnam movies came out, and then throughout the 1980s, things like that. If you think about conflicts like the Gulf War, for example, we've seen a couple of films about that, but this is 20 years in the past, and we still haven't seen a lot of content that basically culturally absorbs those historical events. And I very much see video games in that category. So if you look at all the video games that are out there, some of those are definitely based on war situations or other situations. I'm thinking about shooting games and action games and things like that. Some of those are about the Second World War, some of those are maybe about the Vietnam War or whatever. But it also it takes some time. So I would say that video games are not the most nimble of medium with regard to that. We need some time to digest historical facts before we can actually make video games about them. And I think that's also to a certain extent reflected in COMTOG, because this is essentially a game that talks about the conflict in Syria, which is now enforcing, has been going on for 12 years. And we haven't seen that many films, for example, narrative art films, works of art, specifically about that conflict. I think it's still a bit too young. So I do think that in the future we'll see more things about things like the Syria war, and now of course we have this conflict in Ukraine going, and I think it's in the nature of cultural production actually, that there's always a time between historical events and when you actually see these fictional narrative forms appear, and I do very firmly see video games in that context.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.